Welcome to the Explainer. Have you ever wondered how an obscure, totally confusing mathematical formula buried deep down inside international legal codes could completely upend a multi-billion-dollar global industry? Well, today we're tossing out the dense legalese to look at the real-world impact of trade math. We are unpacking World Trade Organization dispute DS429. It's a massive, years-long clash between the United States and Vietnam over frozen warm water shrimp.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our roadmap for today covers the global shrimp war, unpacking the trade math, the WTO showdown, the final verdict, and finally, the real-world trade fallout.
Section 1. The Global Shrimp War. Let's look at how this whole conflict got started.
To understand the stakes here, we really have to rewind back to 2004. The United States, aiming to protect its domestic producers, slapped some incredibly heavy anti-dumping and countervailing duties on imports of frozen warm water shrimp from Vietnam. And Vietnam was, and honestly still is, a massive global producer of shrimp. When we say heavy duties, I mean we're talking staggeringly high. These tariffs were sometimes reaching as high as 90% before offsets. Just imagine trying to sell your product globally, and literally overnight, the cost of bringing it into your target market practically doubles. That completely freezes out competition. No way around it. But you might be wondering, why were the penalties so severe?
Section 2. Unpacking the trade math. It's time to look under the hood at the U.S. tariff math.
To truly grasp this conflict, we need to understand exactly how the U.S. Department of Commerce mathematically justified these massive tariffs year after year. The first major puzzle piece? It's a highly controversial accounting practice called zeroing. Vietnam basically argued this was just rigged math. It's like, imagine a teacher grading a final exam, right? But they only count the questions the student got wrong, completely ignoring the ones they got perfectly right. If you only look at the errors, well, everyone fails. That's essentially what the U.S. was doing when calculating whether Vietnamese companies were dumping cheap shrimp into the market. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the zeroing method systematically inflates the final duty rate. In a standard calculation, positive margins, so where a product is sold below normal value, and negative margins, where it's sold above normal value, they naturally balance each other out. Simple enough, right? But with the zeroing method the U.S. used, all those negative margins were just erased, literally treated as a zero. This practice systematically, artificially inflates the final penalty imposed on the exporters. But believe it or not, the math doesn't stop there. The second major piece of this puzzle is the non-market economy, or NME presumption. Think of this as the group punishment policy. Think back to grade school, where an entire class is kept inside for recess just because of the actions of a few kids. Under this specific policy, the U.S. Department of Commerce presumed that every single Vietnamese shrimp business was actually part of one giant, government-controlled entity unless they could somehow prove otherwise.
Because of this massive presumption, a single Vietnam-wide rate was applied. This shifted the burden of proof entirely onto individual companies to prove they operated independently in a market economy. If they couldn't jump through those endless administrative hoops, well, independent businesses were handed massive tariffs based on aggregate and sometimes highly adverse facts. They were basically being punished for the assumed structure of their entire country.
Section 3. The WTO showdown. Vietnam decides it's time to take action.
So after years of dealing with this math and group punishment, Vietnam escalates the dispute to the World Trade Organization in 2012, calling them in as the ultimate international trade referee. But listen, international trade law doesn't move at the speed of business, it moves at the speed of bureaucracy. Just look at this timeline. Vietnam requests consultations in 2012. It takes 2 full years before a panel report is even circulated in 2014. The reports aren't formally adopted until 2015, and the arbitration award finally arrives in early 2016. It's an absolutely grueling procedural grind to resolve these kinds of disputes. Section 4. The final verdict. Let's look at the WTO's big ruling in 2015. And this brilliantly illustrates how these complex cases actually shake out. The WTO panel thoroughly examined the complaints, and the final scorecard revealed mixed but really significant results. Vietnam won major victories on the core mathematical issues. The WTO found that the U.S. practice of simple zeroing was inconsistent with the anti-dumping agreement. They also struck down the NME presumption policy. On the flip side, though, the U.S. successfully defended its domestic Section 129 law because Vietnam failed to prove it was inherently inconsistent with WTO rules. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, the WTO doesn't exactly scream, repeal this law immediately, but their findings imply very specific remedies. The U.S. was expected to revoke the anti-dumping order for companies that demonstrably had no dumping. They needed to recalculate those margins without using the zeroing method. And they were required to issue separate, company-specific margins rather than throwing that big blanket NME rate over the entire country.
Section 5. Real-world trade fallout. So the crucial point is, a legal victory on paper doesn't magically erase real-world economic barriers.
The implementation phase is where things get really sticky. An arbitrator actually set a 6-month compliance window for the U.S. to align its practices with the ruling. But the U.S. didn't fully comply within that timeframe. This left Vietnam at a total crossroads. They could either seek authorization for trade retaliation, which obviously provokes huge political tensions, or lean heavily on diplomacy to try and force compliance over time.
Because of this agonizingly slow implementation, let's fast forward a full decade to 2026. Despite winning at the WTO all those years ago, major Vietnamese shrimp companies were still facing high cash deposit rates of around 25% in the U.S. market. The legacy of those initial accounting methods casts a very, very long shadow.
Grounding this legal jargon in stark reality, those persistent tariffs have absolutely devastating effects. By February 2026, trade reports highlighted a massive 60% year-on-year drop in Vietnam's shrimp export shipments to the United States. U.S. importers were simply shying away because of the high costs and the constant nagging policy uncertainty.
This ongoing friction has forced a massive strategic pivot. I mean, you can't put all your shrimp in one basket, right? Vietnamese industry groups are actively cautioning their exporters to diversify. Rather than relying solely on the U.S., prudence dictates seeking out new, more stable markets, places like the European Union and China, just to mitigate these ongoing policy risks.
Which leads us to a final, provocative thought to end our explainer today. We saw Vietnam win the arguments on the math and the rules. But in global trade, what good is a legal victory if enforcement relies entirely on diplomacy? It really makes you consider the limits of international law when there's no global police force to immediately enforce the umpire's call. Think about that next time you hear about a major tariff dispute. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the math.